Hello, inquirers. In today's episode of Podcast for Inquiry, I speak with Allan Offenberger. Allan is a professor emeritus of electrical and computer engineering at the University of Alberta. His research program for more than 40 years was focused on the development of high-power lasers and their application to plasma physics and inertial fusion energy research. He is a past president of the Canadian Association of Physicists and has served on many scientific advisory and research grant committees and boards. Allan was the founding president of the Fusion Energy Council of Canada. He currently serves as an official advisor to a U.S. company involved in laser fusion energy development. In today's episode, we talk about the current state of the art in fusion research, including a major milestone that was reached in December 2022. We talk a lot about how fusion differs from fission and what remains to be done and the timelines involved before fusion can have a major positive impact on our society. I bring you my conversation with Allan Offenberger. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Allan Offenberger, thank you for joining me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Good afternoon. Pleased to be here with you.
So we are recording this in January 2023, and I wanted to speak with you because you are one of Canada's leading experts on fusion technology, and we as a species reached a major milestone in fusion research last month in December 2022. But before we get to that, and I promise you that we will, I want to ask you to describe at a very high level just what is fusion and how it differs from other nuclear technology, the other major nuclear technology which is in place today, which is called fission.
By all means. And the simplest way to illustrate the picture is to say that fusion is the process that powers the sun and all stars. So it truly is the fuel, the source of energy of nature. The difference between fission and fusion is that fission comes from splitting very heavy elements into lighter particles, releasing energy, where fusion is the bringing together of light nuclei and forcing them together, a process called fusion, creating heavier particles. What people might be interested to know is that, in fact, they are a manifestation of fusion. All of our life coming from carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, as well as energy from the sun, all derives from fusion. In the universe, you have hydrogen to start with. It starts fusing to create helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, of which we in our lives are full of. So fusion is that elemental process that created all of the elements and now gives us the chance to liberate energy on Earth like the sun and stars can do.
So you and me, we're all star stuff.
We're all star stuff.
I want to talk mostly about fusion, but I have a question about fission and fusion that has always puzzled me, and I'm hoping you can shed some light on this. I know through my time at the Centre for Inquiry Canada that perpetual motion machines or truly infinite energy claims are always fallacious. There's the second law of thermodynamics, which means that you can never have truly infinite energy. You can't have that doesn't work. But I'm hoping that you can explain to me fission, as you said, involves taking an atom and splitting its constituent parts apart, and you get a bunch of energy. Fusion is you have two different atoms, you put it together, and you get a bunch of energy. And I've always been confused. Well, how is it that splitting things apart creates energy and shoving things together creates energy? Both are apparently true, but that just means we can just put a whole bunch of things together, generating a lot of energy in the process. Then we can split them apart, generating a whole bunch of energy, putting them back together and getting a whole bunch of energy. And there's got to be a flaw in that, because then you've got a perpetual energy machine or perpetual motion machine. That, I was told in high school, violates the laws of physics. So somewhere that argument falls down, but I don't know where. Maybe you can help me with that.
First of all, you can't even invoke that argument, because we are stuff of the universe, and there was that finite amount of energy or mass in the first place. And when I say energy or mass, remember what Einstein taught us. Energy equals mc squared. So if I have mass, I can convert it to energy, or if I have energy, I can convert it to mass. And in fact, whether you're doing fission or fusion, you are doing nothing more than converting a bit of mass into energy. And the reason for that is, whether I have a fission event or a fusion event, the products are lighter than the original constituents. That means there's a change in mass, and that change in mass times c squared gives you the energy released. So yes, there's no perpetual motion, but you don't have to invoke it. We're living in a finite amount of energy and mass, but they are movable back and forth one to the other. So we change a bit of this and we get a bit of that.
So, all right, I'm going to ask one follow-up question, and then we'll move on to the main topic of today's discussion. When there is fission, you have one nucleus, and you shoot neutrons at it, and then they split into two other atoms with a bunch of protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and you get a bunch of excess neutrons. But if you add up all the protons and neutrons, they're all, like, the total number is still the same. And my understanding is that with fission, the number of protons and neutrons from before and after is the same, even though they're now, like, fused into the protons are all fused into a single atom, and you get a couple extra neutrons as well. So where is the loss of mass that happens that gets converted into energy? Like, if a proton disappeared or a neutron disappeared, okay, that has some mass, and I could understand that. But we're not losing any of these subatomic particles. So where's the loss of mass that generates this enormous amount of energy that we see with fission and fusion?
I don't want to get us into a whole lecture on physics here, so I'll avoid that. But I'll give the answer in a simplified form. It's the way that particles come together in the first place that creates what is known as binding energy. And if I change the particle, for example, if I go from just simple particles, carbon to nitrogen, it turns out the binding energy that's involved in the internal particles is different for each element. And so it is at the fission event. When I split it up, it turns out that the binding energy changes from the original to the final products, and that's the source of the energy. So, but I'm not going to go into the physics of binding energy, because that's quantum mechanics in nature.
All right, no, that's fine. That makes that does make some sense. So it's not the mass that's being directly converted. It's that
together, depending upon which element you're talking about.
Right. So the byproducts of fission, from uranium to its byproducts, the byproducts are perhaps they don't have to use as much energy to hold themselves together. So they that excess energy is what it is converted to heat, and that's what we harvest. Okay, thank you. I've always been curious about that. I had to trust the physicists, and I could see that the sun works. So clearly fusion was a thing, but I didn't quite understand how it worked. I'm not a physicist myself. So the reason that I brought you on here today's because fusion is timely. There's been a major milestone reached in December 2022, and I want to speak with you about how significant it is, what it portends over for the next few years and couple of decades, whether it's whether it's a practical breakthrough or primarily a symbolic one, and what it means for fusion as an energy source. So rather than steal your thunder, I'm sure you're aware of what happened in December. So can you explain to our listeners what has happened for the first time, and where and what it means?
Okay. And before talking specifically about that experiment, let me just caution by saying that to make fusion work, you have to be able to bring these particles together very close so that what's called the strong nuclear force can take over and pull them together. And as you recall from your school physics, if I want to bring two positive nuclei together, or any charges together that are positive in nature, they want to repel each other, and it becomes infinitely difficult to bring them together completely. They want to repel each other.
Yeah, just like the two of the same poles of a magnet, right? You try and push them together, and it gets really hard.
But it's the positive and negative charges don't want to uh, come together, the two positive nuclei. So what this says is, in order to give a fusion event a chance, you need to give the particles enough energy that they might come sufficiently close that this so-called strong nuclear force can take over. And if you ask what energy does that take, and the same thing as energy is talking about temperature, we talk about a temperature as the average energy in a box of particles, basically. You have to give enough temperature that those particles can sufficiently get close enough together to make a fusion event happen. That turns out, and we refer to it as the ignition temperature. It's the same as you're putting a match under coal or wood. It'll smolder and then it'll suddenly catch and it'll keep burning. We refer to that as the ignition temperature whenever we burn any carbon fuel. Well, in fusion, to get the particles fusing, we refer to an ignition temperature, a high enough energy of the particles that they can get sufficiently close together to cause a fusion event. That ignition temperature turns out to be 100 million degrees or higher, depending upon the particles.
Okay,
So
that's
we're
pretty
talking
hot.
about incredibly high temperatures. Okay, that sets the first stage of what we're going to have to do when we come to the experiments making it happen. You need high temperature. The second thing is, given that you've got high temperature, what's the state of matter? Well, we think of solid, liquid, and gas as the three normal states of matter we're familiar with. There's a fourth state of matter, which is the higher temperature state beyond solid, liquid, gas, and it's called plasma. And in fact, the universe is 99.9% plasma. It's the highest temperature state, and it's comprised entirely of charged particles.
And that's because most of the matter in the universe is found within stars, and only a tiny fraction of the universe's mass is in planets
Yeah.
like Earth.
And even in interstellar space, it's ionized. Our Earth is a unique kind of object as one of the few solid objects that we have normal lower temperature solid liquid gas. Most of the universe, including interstellar space, is in the plasma, the fourth state of matter condition. So we've got our high temperature plasma. That's the stuff that has to come together and fuse, like in the sun. And for interest's sake, in the sun, the temperature at the center of the sun is about 15 million degrees. So on Earth, we can't get away with 15 million to make it happen because we're a dilute bit of plasma getting together. We're not a big, massive amount like the sun. So we need 100 million degrees to fuse, unlike the sun that can get away with it at 15 million degrees. So
Is
temperature,
that because the gravitational pull is so much stronger in the sun, and that makes up for the lower temperature?
because it's got so much mass under gravitation, right? Yeah. It's just a large amount of mass gravitationally held together. So now that we've got this bath of charged particles trying to fuse, we've had to invest a lot of energy, obviously, to get them to that high temperature state. How do we get more energy out than what we had to invest in the first place? So I won't take you into the formulas, but there is a simple calculation one can do to say that if I've had to heat it a certain amount, get a certain fusion reaction rate going, how much energy can I get out? And then I can equate them and say, if I want more of this than that, what's the minimum condition I need in order to achieve a net energy gain? And that answer turns out to be, well, simple and not so simple. Simple in an equation, difficult in practice to achieve. It says that the density of particles, how many particles per unit volume you have, and the confinement time, how long you can hold them together, that product must exceed a minimum number. And we know what that number is. So let's back up. We have to have a certain temperature of 100 million degrees, and we must have a density and a confinement time exceeding a certain parameter. Well, those are the conditions for fusion. And what we're coming to now in Livermore is an experiment that for the first time achieved success in all three numbers getting to a sufficiently high value that there was a net energy out over energy into the plasma. And I want to distinguish on the scientific and the engineering and the practical applications that we'll get into. But the way in plasma physics we've always defined break even or ignition is to say heat going into the plasma, not the wall plug that you started with, but the heat that gets into the plasma going in, and then the heat coming out of the plasma as defining that ignition point or break even. So when we get break even of more energy out over in, it's not the overall wall plug efficiency. It's how much you had in your hand to put into the heating of the plasma directly.
Okay, so let give me a couple ratios or maybe even numbers here. So talking just about in this containment unit, how much energy went in and how much energy came out, or what was the ratio, how much more energy came out than energy went in, just talking about the containment unit
Okay. And
that received the jolt.
For the Livermore experiment with what's called the National Ignition Facility, it's a high power laser that is capable of delivering into the target about 2 megajoules of energy.
Okay.
And what they got out was 3 megajoules of energy.
So 1.5 times the energy came out.
Right.
That went
now,
in.
If you back up from there and ask, of that 2 megajoules that the laser delivered to the plasma, and actually it wasn't that much that got to the plasma because there's other losses along the way. But in terms of laser energy going in to start with 2 megajoules, if you ask, what did you have to charge up a bunch of capacitor banks in energy in order to allow those lasers to give 2 megajoules, the answer is the capacitors had to have about 300 megajoules. So the net overall, the wall plug efficiency is very bad. Remember, this was a scientific proof of principle experiment. This was not an engineering energy, production system.
So this Livermore NIF facility, for the first time, got more energy out of the reaction than went into the reaction chamber, which is great. I think it's the first time. I'm always excited when we get to do something for the first time as a species, new discoveries or new accomplishments. But in terms of practical applications, people often talk about fusion energy in very lofty terms of infinite energy for everybody. We got 3 megajoules out and put 300 in, so it was 2 orders of magnitude. We got 1% out of the reaction of what we put into the facility. So we're still a long way from fusion being a practical energy source in that sense.
Yes, and let's break it down. When if and when other and we could talk about the whole scope of fusion energy devices around the world, and there's a lot of them, because the alternative mainline approach has been through what's called magnetic confinement fusion, and that's been going on for since the 1950s. And the laser fusion started after the invention of the laser. It really got started in about the middle 1970s. So we're talking about experiments originally devised over the last decades to learn about the state of plasma, learn the theory, learn the computational modeling, learn how to build the devices, understand them, that you could reach this scientific proof of principle that indeed we could make fusion energy on Earth. And that's what's been achieved, and that for the very first time, and that's the scientific significance. There's been decades of investment in people, ideas, and so on to bring us to this state, and it's a delightful state that we find ourselves in. Now you ask the question then, where do we go from here? Well, clearly, there's about a factor of 100 missing around there, and indeed, if you ask the question, just backing up now, we know how to do it. We're going to move from science to engineering to practical generation of fusion. What do we need in the engineering sense? The answer is, and let me just stay with the lasers for the moment, but the same story applies to every other approach. We need an efficiency factor. That's taking your wall plug to what you generate your input heat with. So we need an efficiency factor at that end. And then we need a fusion power gain coming out. So much out for having put so much into the heating of the plasma. And in the laser fusion, it turns out the product of these two numbers, call it an efficiency, that we want to be at least about 10%. And that represents all the wall plug, all the stuff you do in your factory around you. And then you want the fusion gain to be 100 or more.
So this
So we have
reaction
got to one, and
was
now we have to go to
1.5,
100.
right? Like we got more out, 50%. We got 50% more, so 1.5.
Yep.
We got more out than hit the chamber. You're saying what we need to get to is to increase that from 1.5
To
to
100.
100.
Right. That's
Okay.
exactly. So that's what the world is embarking on now, and we know several ways to go about it. And indeed, if you take the excitement, and it actually started a few years back because everybody's been recognizing we've been approaching this scientific break even for some time now. The magnetic confinement side that's been going on for decades, they've had near break-in, 3.5, 0.6 experiments in the past. So we've been very close to unity gain, and now this experiment put us over unity gain with a different approach. So now it's a matter, all will be backing up and trying to push the 100 gain in the case of lasers, and in the magnetic fusion, they'll be looking for power gains of 10 because they'll try to work with the other efficiency factors that are higher to start with. So you get to trade off the efficiency of your front end with the gain of the fusion power system as the two ways to go.
Okay. Now, a lot of people, I think, are going. At least there's a risk that they're going to conflate the three types of nuclear technologies that we have, because right now we have two that are out in the world, and there's a lot of people that seem to think the two are the same, and that is nuclear weapons. One of the objections against nuclear energy, which today is all fission based, they equate nuclear energy with nuclear weapons, and I'm against nuclear energy because I'm against nuclear weapons, and we should disarm and not have and be a nuclear free world. And while I support trying to decommission as many nuclear weapons as possible, up to and including 100% of them, I am not against nuclear energy, fission energy. But when people talk of a nuclear-free world, many of these people mean both in terms of nuclear weapons and fission-based nuclear reactors. is there a risk, in your view, that when fusion energy becomes possible, it will be simply lumped in with as another nuclear technology and be unpopular with sincere environmentalists?
There's always that, because the word nuclear is common, you're right, there could be that apprehension on the part of some. And so what it requires is education. And with education, then you learn that they are, in fact, very different. And I'll just say a couple of things about fusion that can dissuade you. For one, the direct products of fusion are not radioactive like they are from fission reactors. So as you know, we have a radioactive waste handling after we've run our fission reactors for a while because the byproducts themselves are radioactive. The direct products of fusion are not radioactive, so they're not a problem. What can be radioactive is depending upon what you make your reactor walls out of, because coming out of the fusion reaction is a neutron as a particle, and it carries the energy, and you naturally capture that because that's the energy you want. But if that neutron hits, if you make that material wall out of steel that has iron in it, it turns out a neutron can activate an iron to become a temporarily radioactive substance. Now, it doesn't have the long-lived radioactivity. It's only about 10 years. So you can just bury that steel, let it wait for 10 years, and then recycle it. So you don't have long-lived radioactive waste out of the materials if you have a fusion reactor. Indeed, I can make a fusion reactor totally non-radioactive if I build it out of silicon carbide. And the world is working on material science, obviously, so as to make fusion totally non-radioactive. A, because the intrinsic reaction is not radioactive, and B, if I have the materials around it non-activatable, then I just don't build the problem in the first place. So let me summarize the fusion hazard in the following sense. If I built it out of silicon carbide, I'd have absolutely zero radioactivity forever. If I build it out of something as a temporary technology that can be radioactivated, it turns out I can bury that for 10 years and reuse the material, so I don't have long-term radioactive waste to worry about. Thirdly, if I compare fusion versus fission versus natural radioactivity, and that's what we do with coal plants. People don't think about it. Coal plants produce most of the radioactivity that we're exposed to, apart from space sending particles at us on the face of the earth. We don't think about the radioactive hazard in mining and transporting and burning coal, but in fact, it is one very large radioactive substance. So if you compare fusion to that as a baseline, because the world has said we're prepared to live with that for whatever reason, in fact, as they say, if you build it out of silicon carbide, you'd never have an issue at all. If you build it out of iron with some iron in it, then you would be able to drop below the radioactivity of coal, the natural world's background of coal and incoming particles. You could drop below that in about 10 years to recycle your materials into the next generation of power plants. So there's not a problem there. The other one that is the question, the fuel of fusion is tritium. Now, tritium is not a natural isotope.
So just so that people can know, can you tell us what tritium is?
Yes. The fuels of fusion that we're working on now are deuterium and tritium. They are two isotopes of hydrogen. Deuterium takes the H of H2O, it adds one neutron, and it makes a particle that we call deuterium.
So that's the hydrogen, one proton in the nucleus, and then which is the normal state of hydrogen, and we add to that one neutron, so we have two particles in the nucleus, and that's deuterium because there's two particles in the nucleus.
That's right. And if I add another neutron, I form tritium. So
okay.
proton with two neutrons makes tritium. And in the sun, we just burn hydrogen, just protons. That's the reaction going on in the sun. On Earth, that calls for even more heat or high temperature than the deuterium tritium reaction. And so mankind has been concentrating on making the deuterium tritium fusion reaction practical on Earth because it's easier at only 100 million degrees.
One of the things I love about talking to physicists is that you hear phrases like only 100 million degrees.
The rest go up from there. So you have deuterium and tritium as the input particles, but tritium is not. Deuterium in the oceans are full of it. We've got billions of years of fuel. Tritium is not. In fact, the tritium we produce decays away in about 12 years. And if you think of the tritium that's been used in illuminating your watches and other schemes along the way, we use it in a number of areas. But the tritium that we have on Earth has to be man-made. Now, question is, inside that fusion reactor, is there a natural way of making the tritium? Indeed, it turns out there is. Because if you think about the particles of fusion coming out, a neutron and the other is helium, and helium is perfectly benign, but the neutron comes out, we want to capture it for its energy, and in addition, we want it to do some useful work by having it collide with lithium to create the tritium that we need for the fusion reaction.
Okay, so guide me through this. So we have a lithium atom
inside by having a neutron come out, be absorbed in a lithium blanket. The lithium blanket generates the tritium then, and you recycle, you process that lithium circulation going out to extract the tritium to go back into the target fuel cycle.
So we need some lithium, and that's, I mean, it's not a rare earth. It's not hugely common, but there's lots of lithium in the Earth's crust. We need to make a little bit of tritium somehow. We've got the technology. We know how to do that. It might be expensive, but we get a seed amount of tritium, and then we build a plant, and we harvest all the deuterium that we need. From the ocean. The plant itself, once it's up and running, creates its own tritium. We get a whole bunch of energy, and that becomes largely self-sustaining. Is that the vision?
That's the vision, and the reason it has to be is the fact that there isn't a supply of tritium sitting there waiting for you. You have to generate your own tritium to keep the fuel cycle going. So it really is a self-generating system. So if we put a few of the pieces together here then, on an individual reaction, it's deuterium and tritium. The deuterium came from the ocean. The tritium had to be produced by us running that factory. How do we get that? We use the neutrons, one of the byproducts of fusion, to react with lithium in a blanket that's circulating. It's being heated up, first of all, by the neutrons passing through that lithium blanket. And that's what in your ordinary power plants, we tend to use water as or other fluids as the recirculating heat removal blanket, and then we convert it to steam to make.
Well, that's perfect. That was going to be my next question.
Let's leave that for a minute. So,
okay.
Given that water is the normal heat removal system for a lot of our plants on Earth, we're talking about using lithium then as that heat recirculating system that now happens to contain some tritium in it because it's been generated by the neutrons being absorbed in the lithium. And you just process that lithium blanket to remove the tritium to keep producing the fuel for the fusion reaction. But that does point to one of the two major problems. The first we've already indicated is materials. To make everything work, materials are going to be a critical issue for fusion. They've got to stand up to the very high temperature operating conditions. You'll never let the plasma touch the wall, but it's nevertheless going to get heated. So you have to have material that will withstand the high temperature, that will withstand particle bombardment, that will be recyclable, that will be producible on large scale. And that's why material science is going to be, fusion is going to work or not work according to how well we do our material science. The second thing we need then is the tritium fuel, because it's not there in nature. We have to make it as we go. And that means, just like we talk about energy gain, this just demonstrated in the laser, a gain of 1.5. If we can't have a gain of tritium in that recirculation system greater than unity, we are going to lose the battle. We'll burn up all the tritium and never have enough to keep it going. So tritium, fuel, cycle, processing and everything is going to become another very serious main
Right.
thing to be done.
So that as wonderful as this breakthrough was, there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made.
Yes, indeed.
All right. So for pretty much all of our major centralized facilities for making energy, I'm thinking coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear fission, uh, basically all operate under the principle of you do something that generates heat. You burn coal, you burn oil, you burn gas, you create a nuclear fission reaction, and all of these generate a bunch of heat. You then use that heat to boil water. The water turns into steam, which turns turbines, and those turbines get converted into electricity, which is then sent through the wires and does all the things that electricity does in our society. Would fusion work in the same way, where the heat generated from fusion would be harvested, creating I don't know, water or some other liquid to boil, and then using the steam to turn a turbine? Or would there be some other way to convert the energy output into electricity?
The first quick answer is that will be the same approach. So your fusion heater will replace a coal burner, a natural gas burner, an oil burner as the source of heat to go through the standard boiling water to make steam to run electrical generators. There's two additional factors that come in, though. One is that in the long range, there's also fusion processes that could give rise to direct electrical generation through charged particles rather than non-charged particles. And so you could have direct electrical conversion in the long run out of some fusion
So
process.
when you say the long run, how
That's
many
because it
decades?
has to run at higher temperature.
Okay, so we're talking. We don't know how many decades, but that's a long way out. At this point, it's little more than a dream. However theoretically feasible it might be.
The answer is yes and no.
Okay.
It's a lot more difficult, but the other side of it is, as we come to talk about what's going on in the world and companies, there are companies that are pursuing that as their objective at the get-go. They're saying we don't want to do the neutron and the radioactivity. We want to go to direct charge particle, direct electrical conversion in the first place. So there are people pursuing that route already, but they've got a bigger hurdle to get
Good,
over.
good luck to them. But okay. Yeah.
So the first of all, then fusion is just call it a heat source then.
Sure.
But
Okay.
two other aspects that come in the sense of how efficient or how you can couple this. The first is that fusion intrinsically is running at very much higher temperature than any other system. Even fission systems, they're basically running at 300 degrees. We most of the world runs around 300 degrees Celsius. In the case of fusion, all the temperatures, even in the circulating blankets, are going to be 600 or 700 degrees or more, which allows you to go to different power generation schemes. You can use a combination of multiple generation Brayton cycles and so on. Let's not get into the details, but instead of the simple electrical generation we do now, we can have a multi-stage generation that overall makes the overall conversion far more efficient. And so much so that we don't have to have water at the end of the day as our cooling. We could just exhaust the residual heat into the air around us. Now, that would be a big advantage if in our systems we didn't have to draw on the world's clean water to heat our power generating plants. So
So it
that
would be like a closed loop system where we wouldn't need a continual input of new water. We'd have like just we need a certain amount to get started, but then we just reuse that again and again and again.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah. So there's a real advantage to that. The other environmental, because that's what this is all leading to, but all the other environmental impacts turn out to be favorable for fusion too. In that, let's back up to the fuel. When we dig up coal, haul it in the trains to bring it into the burning, uh, it takes typically an awful lot of coal that you have to burn every day just to keep your power plant going. And in the course of burning that coal, you generate a lot of noxious byproducts, sulfur dioxides, and everything else, radioactivity as well. If I use fission by comparison, instead of the 10,000 ton, let me just take a 1 day usage of fuel. Instead of something like 10,000 tons of coal being needed to run the gigawatt power plant, in the case of fission, I can get by with less than 100 kilograms of fuel.
So 10. So let's use the same. Let's just use the same units here. So you're saying 10,000 tons
Tons of coal.
of coal for 1 day in a gigawatt. Gigawatt is it's a big plant. So a really big coal plant uses 10,000 tons of coal, and a single day for a fission that's a similar size. The big nuclear power plant uses
gigawatt. In all case, 1 gigawatt.
1 gigawatt.
Seven.
1 ton is 1,000 kilograms. 1 ton.
Yep.
So 10,000 to 1 is the ratio that we're talking about for the same power output.
And more. And then we're going to fission 77 kilograms, not 1 ton. We're going to 77 kilograms.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said 1,000 kilograms.
No.
I misheard you.
No. 10. No, I said 77 kilograms.
Okay. So, oh my gosh. Okay. So,
and then I want to get to fusion. So let's get to fusion before we.
Sure.
We're talking about a massive change here. Large amounts of coal to modest amounts of fission fuel, uranium, to what do I need for the fusion plant for 1 day? About a kilogram.
A kilogram of what?
Of deuterium tritium.
Deuterium tritium. Okay. Wow.
So think about that.
So that's
think about going from 10,000 tons of coal to burn for 1 day versus 1 kilogram of fusion.
So that's 10 million kilograms. 10 million kilograms.
We're talking more than a million in the ratio. That's right.
10 million kilograms to 1 kilogram. Once we can get once we get fusion up and running, and even today we're looking 10 million kilograms to 77 kilograms in a typical nuclear fission reactor. So let me bring up the other objection.
Can I just finish on the environmental
yes,
just for 1 minute?
Yeah.
So in terms of the net amount of fuel and waste you generate, the process, the handling, and everything else, and the question then is, to get it, you had to go out and explore for it, find it, dig it up, process it, move it, burn it, and then get rid of the waste at the end of the day. So if I have to do all that work for 10,000 tons versus doing it for a kilogram, as you can imagine, there's a lot less overall processing.
Right. I mean, I imagine a kilogram of tritium and deuterium will be expensive and energy intensive to create, but still a lot less than 10,000 tons or 10 million kilograms of coal.
Yeah. So I'm saying that the overall net impact of fusion, if we have that as our power producer versus coal or fission even, is so much more efficient in all sorts of ways. The amount of stuff you have to dig up, find, process, burn, etc., handle as waste, the environmental impact of what's coming out in terms of net pollution and everything else. You've just won every argument. The land impact, if you ask what's the net land impact, if we do wind turbines, solar, we have to consume a lot of land to create a given amount of energy. Fusion, in comparison, let's put it this way, the environmentalists have two important numbers to characterize the different sources of energy. One is the so-called energy payback ratio, and the other is the life cycle assessment. The energy payback is how much energy did it cost you in total, cradle to grave, to use a given source for what you get out.
Are any of our current sources positive in that sense? I get that. Before we get to
Well,
fusion,
let me give you the number. Let me give you the numbers.
okay,
In the case of, so there's this energy payback
yeah,
ratio, and then the other one is the life cycle. How much CO2 do you produce per unit of
right,
what you've used? The life cycle assessment. Fusion beats fission, beats wind, beats solar, and it certainly beats coal and all the rest. Coal is up at about 1,000 units. CO2 or natural gas is at about half that. And then you're coming down solar and other things. When you add up all the impact
right. You
numbers,
still have to mine the solar panels, and you still need to build the big structures for wind turbines. So there's some carbon impact, even if the generation part of it is it does not involve additional carbon outputs.
yeah. So the end of the day is, and that this is ultimately why mankind has been motivated, as difficult as it is, for the last 50, 60 years to get it. It is the Holy Grail. It'll give you the cleanest, longest lived, sustainable energy source. And it runs efficiently. And it's such that you could site it in the middle of your cities. So in some cases, you'll have it elsewhere, wherever the industry is. In other cases, you'll put it on the ocean because you want to do desalination. But if I want that heat source right in the middle of my city, with fusion, I can do
Okay,
that.
so I was going to ask something else, but I want to pursue that idea. I can understand why someone might be a little bit nervous about something that's 100 million degrees a block away in the middle of a city. Something like nuclear fission, it one of the main objections to it is that, okay, fine, it works great, but it fails catastrophically. If things go terribly wrong, as we saw in Chernobyl or more recently with Fukushima, it has really major effects in the nearby area, the no-go zones, and so on. What if something goes wrong with a fusion plant? We've got plasma that's at 100 million degrees, and I don't know, corruption, shoddy engineering, bad design. Nuclear physicists tend to be very careful, and I don't want to cast aspersions on them, but we're dealing with people. We're talking with a very long chain of people, and somebody might make a mistake somewhere along the line, or there might be something different or unanticipated that happens. What if something goes wrong in a fusion plant? What are the consequences of that? What are the risks that might be present? That might people say might have people object to a fusion plant in their downtown cores.
Okay, let's take this Livermore experiment that released the megajoules of energy. Let's scale it up 100 because now it's ready to run as a fusion power plant.
Great.
Okay, so let's talk about the energy and the hazards then. In the first place, if I don't fire a laser beam in, I don't trigger a reaction, the place shuts down. If I don't inject a pellet, it shuts down. That's the one side. I've got total control on it. The other is, if the accident ever happened, what's the net residual energy I have to worry about? And the answer is that net energy inside a plasma, a magnetic or inertial, but in the case of the laser, that amount of energy is so small, it's not a big hazard. And there's no big long-term residual heat like there is for fission. Remember, the problem with Fukushima was the fact that the radioactivity keeps producing energy. So all the while that you can't get access to it, heat's being generated. You have to keep supplying cooling to it because you've got to live with that long-term radioactivity producing energy. In the case of fusion, there is no long-term radioactivity for one, and there's basically no residual heat. You can shut that plant down and it's just a benign thing. It really is that simple. The net energy content sitting inside that plasma is so small that I can absorb that.
Even it's creating. I'm just boggled by a moment because like we've got a gigawatt. We've got a gigawatt fusion reactor in this hypothetical example, which is an enormous amount of energy. And you're
Oh,
describing.
that's power. That's not energy.
Okay.
That's power.
Okay. So we're generating a gigawatt worth of power in this hypothetical future fusion reaction, and you're saying that the residual energy, should something go wrong, is very small. I'm just trying to reconcile the very large and the very small here.
Yeah. And that is part of the story. That's what's so nice about
Wow.
fusion.
Okay.
The residual energy is so small, it's not a hazard if you shut the plant down. You don't have the Fukushimas or Chernobyls with long-term heat being generated that you've got to somehow handle and cope with. So that's just makes it so much more benign.
Great.
Yeah, and what was the other point that you in your original question that I thought I should try and address? Anyway, so given that I've got total control by taking my laser fusion power plant, if I don't fire the laser beam, I shut it down right now. I've got 100% control. If I don't inject a pellet of fuel, I shut it down right now. And thirdly, if I don't fire it, but I just have had that plasma, what happens to it? I just let that megajoule die. That was the other number I wanted to give you. If you ask, how dangerous is a megajoule of energy? Not very much. If you take and make your cup of coffee in the morning and you boil a kettle of about a liter of water, you produced a megajoule right there. So imagine megajoule as energy just sitting around. Okay, it's not an explosive; it's just energy at a megajoule. It's not very much, or 10 megajoules is not very much. It's 10 liters of water heated up to the boiling point. So the energy content is the safety factor here in a fusion power plant. The amount that just doesn't pose a hazard to the outside world.
Okay, I've got one more skeptical question for you, and I want to know the other objection that I hear up against nuclear fission energy is that is more on a practical level. It takes decades to get through all the regulatory approvals. It's a huge amount of land that is required. It's a huge, very complex, very sensitive bit of engineering that's required, and even under the best case scenario, nuclear fission energy is appropriate for baseline, meeting baseline needs, but you can't scale up or down the amount of energy a fission reactor is making quickly. So on the really hot summer days when power demand spikes, fission reactors are not going to be much help. We need something else to bring us to meet that excess demand. So on these factors, land use, regulatory approvals, meeting spikes of demand, how similar or different are fission and fusion?
That's a very good question because it's going on, that discussion at the present time, as you can imagine. And I'll mention two aspects. One is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the U.S., in fact, for the last year or so, has been engaged in all the details of how will the U.S. handle this. In the meantime, the UK has already prescribed what is going to happen. You may or may not be aware, even back under Boris Johnson, they said in the UK, hey, we want to become a world leader in fusion. Then the government has committed a lot of money and resources to make it happen. In fact, they've already selected a site that is to be the location for the first fusion demonstration plant in the UK. But let me do the regulatory. What they did in the UK was to look at this issue of health, safety, regulatory. And as we on the fusion side have been saying, we're not a hazard like the fission side. The UK government has said we're going to treat all fusion plants under normal business health safety regulatory processes. No nuclear word involved whatsoever.
So you have to follow, if you build a fusion plant in the UK, you have to follow all the same rules and regulations if you were building a manufacturing plant, a factory of some kind. There's stuff in place, but nothing more than that.
Nothing more than that. And the US, already the discussions, and I've sat in on quite a few of them with these Zoom meetings in the US, that's probably where it's going to end up when they bring out their regulation too. In fact, they've had a lot of state input because if you take various accelerators, medical, other applications that have radioactivity, et cetera, and the states are intimately involved, therefore they get input to the federal process, and they're all saying to the U.S. federal nuclear regulatory, yes, we can handle this through our normal state regulation processes.
So let me ask a cynical question for a moment. Of course, the fusion industry is going to say, no, governments of the world, we're safe. No, governments of the world, we don't need any additional regulation. I'm going to appeal to you not as an advocate for fusion, but as an expert. Is that appropriate? It's clearly what the fusion industry would want. Is it appropriate to regulate at that level, or is some additional oversight? Should there be some additional oversight or regulations involved? Because no industry wants any regulations. You've got cigarettes where the advertisement was 9 out of 10 doctors prefer the smooth taste of Camel cigarettes, and clearly they were lying about the health effects. There's no shortage of examples where industries have claimed that their product or service is safe to avoid regulation. It turned out it wasn't. Is fusion genuinely going to be safe enough that existing regulations are sufficient to merit no additional scrutiny or oversight or regulations?
Before I give you my answer, I'll repeat by the process that the UK went through and what is being done in the US too now, it is having a lot of input from authorities of all types. So when the decision was taken to do it that way, it wasn't because of the fusion industry, because it doesn't really exist yet in any significant way. It's all the oversight people that were looking in on it and saying, yes, okay, this is one we can live with. And now my response is, yes, I, as a professional in the field, apart from the normal hazards, and those exist in all ways, with this as with any other industry, there's no end of ways people can hurt themselves in any particular place. But as for fusion being any more dangerous than any other kind of facility, I would say no. That this is something you can trust that will work when it's finally made. But we've got a lot of years to get there. That's the big problem right now. There's still decades of engineering to be done to demonstrate it. Maybe we could just turn for a moment and follow that up, because your question leads directly into it. Who are the players out there? Now, what is really going to happen? How quickly will these regulations begin to impact what may or may not happen? There is a loose association forming, well, even that, not an NGO in the U.S., the Fusion Industry Association, and loosely coupling all the companies in the world that have aspiration to getting into the fusion business. And there's about 36 companies that have emerged now. And as you can imagine, this is going to be expensive development before we ever see a payoff. So the initial funders tend to be the deep-pocketed individuals Gates and Bezos and Koshlas and others around the world who have time and money in their pocket to spend. But saying, yes, this is a holy grail. We want to be part of it. And now we see the way because we've reached the point of scientific feasibility. It now turns to engineering and economics. These three dozen companies, they represent approaches that go everything from the mainline approaches, which were magnetic in the past, and continuing to the new laser fusion, inertial fusion approach, and a whole variety in between. When I mentioned the three parameters we needed to make it work, temperature, density, and confinement time, you can play with that density and confinement time all over the place, and different companies come in and say, "Hey, I'm gonna go at it this way." Is
Lower
my
temperature but higher confinement time, and another player will do the exact opposite.
and you're trading off density of confinement and confinement time mostly, yeah. Um, so different companies are coming in with different niches, and they're based all over the world. Uh, we'll Let me pick four for a moment out of that three dozen because these four have come out and said we think we can have practical demonstration in the 2030s. Think about it. That's a decade.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Commonwealth Fusion Systems in Massachusetts. They are a spin-off from MIT and funded by Gates and Bezos and everybody, along with the Italian oil and gas company Eni. They've got about $2 billion worth of investment already to take their technology and bring it out. And they're saying they think they can put a prototype out by 2035. There's a company in California, TAE, what used to be Tri-Alpha Energy. They want to do the direct energy conversion. They have hundreds of millions investment, approaching $1 billion. They think they can do this into the 2030s. We have General Fusion, a Canadian company based in Burnaby, Vancouver. Um, but they've actually gone over to build it in the UK because it's been more hospitable there to get off the ground. So they're going to do their first prototype demonstration in the UK. They say they can do it in 5 years. And there's another company in Washington State, Helion, that also says they can do it with their technique and approach in the 2030s. So out of the panoply, my sense is by 2100, fusion is going to be the mainstay power for everything. But backing up to 2050, we're not going to be supplying all the world's energy by that time for this net zero objective. But we would hope that there would be the first phase demo plants that are already out there by the 2050 timeframe. And then you've got those very optimistic saying 2030s we're gonna show the world. But I'm going to add a decade to that to give me a comfort zone in terms of all these issues that we talked about that have to be solved in an engineering and then economic sense to bring fusion to the table. But if we can have our first demo plants anywhere from 2035 to 2045, that will be a real accomplishment because once the first one comes, it'll move very fast thereafter. And what encourages me now is the research and development to this phase, remember, has been essentially fully funded by governments around the world. So it's been a research and development approach, slow and steady, let's get it right. Now industry is coming in. They want answers. They want solutions faster because they want to make a buck on their investment. And once the private sector gets involved, things are going to move very much faster. Moreover, it's now buttressed by the U.S. The White House is firmly behind fusion. They've appointed, as a White House appointee, a lead coordinator to coordinate the public-private activity in the U.S. The money's starting into it. They're looking for first proposals from industry in the U.S. as to how to move their business plans forward. So we'll see things in 10 years very different
Okay.
to what we are today.
We've been talking about this for about an hour, so I've got a dozen questions I want to ask, but I've got one that I really want to get out at you. Last year, I recorded a diatribe about how livid I was and still am that the massive amount of government funding that went into COVID research to find a vaccine was successful. Very pleased about the success of COVID vaccines. The part that made me livid was that then the various pharmaceutical companies were granted patents on the research and technologies that were developed through government funding. And my question for you is: you just said that we're at the state that we are with our fusion knowledge through government funding, and industry is coming in. Is there a chance that we're going to face this? We're going to run into the same thing where a private company is going to make some small advance on the massive foundation that decades of research funded by governments has done, and then patent the entire tree, like the entire amount, so that no other companies can use their particular approach? How are we going to allow, is that what's going to happen? How can we prevent it if we don't want that to happen? And how can we have a thriving industry where there's lots of different players trying lots of different things, instead of the first mover coming in and then closing off through legal and intellectual property maneuvers, preventing other companies from building on the research and the findings of the last 50 to 60 years?
I don't have a final answer for you, but I think some parts include the fact that government already has so much of the intellectual property, so that has to be purchased, acquired, licensed, and so on in the first place. The second is because there are so many companies jumping in, coupled with the fact that, as I say, my sense is we're looking more like 2 decades, not 1 decade. That gives an awful lot of development time for all these various players in terms of going at their particular approaches. There's going to be a lot of healthy competition and new ideas generated, and no one is going to win the day. Out of all of these approaches, I don't know how many will be commercially successful, but more than one will.
Right.
So there won't be a.
There'll be some failures, some promising avenues that just for one reason or another don't work out. But with a lot of different approaches, a lot of different avenues being pursued, some of them will be successful.
Yeah. So we have to assume the idea of the competitiveness over a long period will give us diversity in the end players. I hope so.
Well, I think this is fascinating. I think it's promising. It's very exciting, and I hope we're able to stave off the climate catastrophe long enough that energy production will no longer be a significant contributor to climate change. I have children. I hope down the road, in due course, to have grandchildren, and I want. One of my big fears is that they will not be growing up in on a planet that is nearly as hospitable to life as the one that I and all of my ancestors have grown up with. So hoping we can get our act together in other areas to allow fusion to be the main and primary source of our very energy intensive lifestyle. Allan Offenberger, thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with me today. Any last thoughts for our listeners?
No, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I hope the topics we've touched on give some additional sense of where we are, where it's going, how long it might take, and what the promise could deliver in the long run.
If someone wanted to learn more about fusion or any of the topics that we've talked about today, are there any resources online that you would recommend?
Well, I'll mention a few, and if you just do a simple Google search, you'll find them. For one, we have an organization in Canada called the Fusion Energy Council of Canada. If you look that one up, you'll be taken to a website and you'll see links there. So Fusion Energy Council of Canada.
I will link to that in the show notes, so you can people will be able to find it there.
If you go to Department of Energy in the U.S., there's no end of different sources there, including directly to the labs, such as Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, LLNL, and there you'll get the direct coupling to the Livermore story on NIF. The other big one is ITER, ITER. Google that, and that'll bring you up the webpage for the large international-based tokamak project in Cadarache in France. That's a multi-nation undertaking. And that's an important story. We haven't got into the details of any of these, of course, but ITER on the magnetic. If you go to Commonwealth Fusion Systems, you'll get the webpage of a company that will take you into their story. And it could go on. If you were to generically do laser fusion companies or magnetic fusion companies, that'll probably string you out into a lot of these others. But the other important one that will give you all these companies directly, I should have said it first, is a name I mentioned before, Fusion Industry Association, FIA in the US. And their webpage will give you a banner showing all the companies who belong to their NGO.
Wonderful. Allan Offenberger, thank you once again. This has been fantastic.
Okay, my pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. Email us at podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centerforinquiry.ca/donate or becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. Your contribution supports our efforts to have rational and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centerforinquiry.ca. We are on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Lee Shields, Zach Dumont, and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.